India and Australia have remained at the bottom of their own consciousness about each other for quite a number of years. But of late, the awareness about each other's strengths, each other's investment opportunities has increased thanks to both the sides thinking about the country, India thinking about Australia, Australia thinking about India in the current geopolitical scenario. But more than that, I think the consciousness about India in Australia and about Australia in India needs to be raised. How does one do that? And as we speak, the Australian government has just received a very voluminous report called An India Economic Strategy to 2035, authored by former Foreign Secretary of Australia, Mr. Peter Varghese, who was also the Indian High Commissioner, the High Commissioner of Australia to India between 2009 and 2012. And we are lucky to have him with us here to tell us more about what this strategy means and what philosophy is behind this report that he's come up with after almost a year-long work, extensive work on various sectors of cooperation and investment that Australia can bring to India. Mr. Varghese, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Nitin.
Thank you
Delighted to be here.
Thank you for speaking to us. As I see this, it's a very comprehensive, detailed 500-page report that you have prepared, and you are here in India to talk to various people, the think tanks, some investment, I'm sure, bankers and investment companies. What is the philosophy and what is the purpose of this particular report that you have done?
Well, the report really has two broad objectives. One is consciousness raising and the other is strategic positioning. So this is a report to the Australian government. So the primary audience is Australian government, business and the community more generally. I wanted to use the report as an opportunity to present to an Australian audience an up-to-date picture of what is happening in India and what that means for Australia and the region more broadly. Because I think the Indian growth story is going to be quite a seminal development over the 20-year horizon that the report covers. The main conclusion in the report for Australia is that there is no other single market anywhere globally which offers more growth potential for Australian business than the Indian market over the next 20 years. And what flows from that is that Australian business needs to take a look at India and to ask themselves the simple question, can we afford not to be in this market over the next 20 years? Now, that doesn't mean that every Australian business needs to be rushing into India and doing business, but at the very least they do need to be able to answer that question. For some it'll be a good fit, for others it may not be. I think it's particularly important for Australia to be looking more strategically at the Indian market at this juncture in history, because we are entering into quite an uncertain period internationally, whether it's geopolitically or economically. And one of the arguments in my report is that it makes sense for Australia to spread its risk in its economic relationships. At the moment, 40% of our exports go to just two markets, and in any period of volatility, a good risk management strategy is to spread your risk. So India offers us a real opportunity to do that. Here is an economy which, by PPP measures, is already the third largest economy in the world. I've taken a relatively moderate view about the rate of growth, but I say 6 to 8% growth per year for the next 20 years is an entirely realistic expectation for the Indian economy. So if you fast forward 6 to 8% growth on the third largest economy in the world,
yes.
Or even if it's the fifth or sixth largest, if you use nominal exchange rates, that is a very significant story, not just for India.
Right.
But beyond scale, you need some structural complementarity if you're to translate scale into opportunity.
True.
And what I've done in the report is to identify 10 sectors where I think there is some structural complementarity between the demand in the Indian economy over 20 years and Australia's capacity to supply.
Right.
I've divided those 10 sectors broadly into a flagship sector, which is education. 3 sectors where I think Australia has the potential to position itself amongst the top half dozen or so partners of India, and that is resources, agribusiness and tourism. And then I have 6 sectors which at one level can be seen as niche sectors,
Sure.
Most of them in the services area where Australia has a chance to position itself as a niche supplier to what will obviously be a very large Indian market.
Right.
And the other element in the strategy is to focus on states and regions in India instead of thinking of India as a single national economy, because I wanted to give our business people something they some options and something they can touch and feel. It's one thing to talk about the big story of India and the potential of India and the scale of India, but you need to be able to translate that into...
And then you've gone into nitty-gritty as I see it. You called it, I think, 10 sectors, 10 states.
Exactly.
So you have sort of given them the options where they can fit in or do that kind of thing. So a pretty detailed report, I must say, on the Indian opportunities that are available in India. Some states you have identified that are ripe for investment. So in that sense... but the question that comes as a corollary of what you just said is, obviously you want to want Australian businesses to spread their risk. But given that they have already invested into some of these economies like China and the US, how easy or hard it will be for them to look at India? Will it be a secondary kind of a job that they will do, or you think some businesses can actually look at India as a primary market?
I think it'll be a mix. I mean, I think some businesses will find India as their primary market, and for some businesses it'll be part of a portfolio of markets for them. But the ambition is to lift India into our third largest export market and our third largest destination of foreign direct investment in Asia. And that will require quite a shift in the magnitude of the relationship. But you know, I mean, Australia has a broad range of global markets. I mean, we're a strong trading nation. We're a strong exporting nation. The emphasis on investment is quite deliberate, and I see investment as playing a particularly important role in the Australia-India economic relationship. See, for most of our relationships in Asia, our economic relationships in Asia, they've been big on trade and relatively modest on investment. I think India offers an opportunity for more balance between trade and investment and more synergy between trade and investment, because the Indian growth story will be very investment dependent, and importantly, I think India's investment policy settings are likely to become more and more open, and that will happen whether or not trade settings
picks up or not,
become more and more open. So that investment target is quite an important part of the strategy.
I'm glad you make that distinction, because you also have a remark which I found very interesting. You said India marches to its own tune. It's not China. What do you mean by that? Do you want to elaborate a little bit?
Well, I think it's important for Australian business to understand India in its own terms. Some people look at India and because of scale see it as the next China, but you need to go beyond that perception. I mean, these are two very different economies. The drivers of growth in each economy are different. The political systems are very different.
Completely.
The institutional background and structures are also different. And so I think if you start off thinking India is the next China, you will miss what is distinctive about the Indian market. If you miss what is distinctive about the Indian market, you will have trouble understanding it.
That's right.
So that's the logic of saying that India is not the next China.
Yeah.
And bear in mind, I mean, the Chinese economy is 5 times
Yeah, of course.
the size of the
Indian economy.
So
Yeah,
there is a rather large gap there.
Of course, you must tell the Australian investors and businessmen that you need tons of patience to be in India, because
you probably need patience for any market, but I think it is particularly important for India. So I mean, I've used the 3 P's in my report. You need preparation, you need perspective, and you need patience.
Yes.
And I think each of those are important as you enter the Indian market, as is probably finding a partner in India with whom you can work effectively and who can help navigate what will be a different business culture and a different sort of environment for Australian business.
Completely, but there is hope, because I met someone on my recent trip to Australia who has been trying to get a big contract in the telecom sector for the last 9 years, and he's still hopeful that he'll get it, because it is the scale is big, huge.
Yes.
So he's patient enough, and I was very surprised, to be very frank.
Yes, telecom in India?
In India.
Yeah.
India. So
Well,
optic fiber.
One of the very early players in the Indian mobile phone network was Telstra, which came to India very, very,
very early. Yes.
early. And indeed, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but I think it's true. The first telephone call made on a mobile network in India was on a Telstra network.
Possible, quite possible. So there is a precedent to that. The Indian market being tapped by the Australians. But let's move away a little bit from trade and investment to geopolitics.
Sure.
Indo-Pacific is now the new flavor of the season for the last 1 year or so. And I, of course, heard you saying yesterday that Indo-Pacific is now an accepted term in Asia, and also the second point about centrality of ASEAN being mentioned.
Yes.
So if you want to break it down for us, how do you see the Indo-Pacific construct playing into the strategy that Australia needs to have vis-a-vis India and in the larger Asian context?
Yeah. Well, Australia was an early mover in terms of reconceptualizing its strategic environment to embrace the Indo-Pacific. Because for most of the post-war period, our frame of reference was the Asia-Pacific, and the Asia-Pacific did not include India. So when we first started thinking about the Indo-Pacific as a construct, it was driven really by 2 factors. The first was that we thought we had to find a conceptual structure which brought India into the strategic system that we were operating in, and that reflected not just the weight of India and the importance of India, but it reflected the way in which India was likely to be pulled more and more eastward as its economic and other interests drove it in that direction. So, look east, act east. I mean, the logic of that is that India and East Asia and the Asia Pacific become much more enmeshed. The second driver was a recognition that the big challenges geostrategically over the next several decades are likely to be maritime in nature in one form or another. Yeah. And so a construct which finds the conceptual link between the Pacific and the Indian Oceans for a continent like Australia, which faces both oceans, had a certain neat symmetry to it. So I think the Indo-Pacific is very much a work in progress. I don't think you can look at it as a fully formed concept yet.
True.
There is quite a range of views as to where it begins and ends. I tend to take a more minimalist geographic definition of the Indo-Pacific, which is to stretch the Asia-Pacific only as far as India, for all of the reasons that I mentioned. But we are, I think, beginning to see the Indo-Pacific as a single strategic system, and it has the key players that are going to be essential in developing a new strategic equilibrium.
Sure.
In this part of the world, because we are entering into a new phase of geopolitics and economics in the region, and it's important that we try and manage that as effectively as possible.
That's right. So there are two aspects to that, the new geopolitical situation: the balancing China
Yes.
and engaging with China.
Yes.
It can't be, one can't be exclusive to the other. So
Well, exactly. You can't you can't and shouldn't contain China. I mean, containment was a strategy that worked during the Cold War, dealing with the Soviet Union, which was economically not integrated into the global economy.
True.
China is deeply integrated
Absolutely.
into the global economy, and for over 100 countries, it's their largest trading partner. So the idea that you could contain China, I think, is a complete policy dead end.
Right.
But as China continues to develop as an economic power, and as China increasingly articulates a strategic ambition of predominance in Asia, I think there will be a natural instinct to not only engage China, but also to seek to balance China.
True.
And I think the Indo-Pacific will be, if you like, the framework within which this balancing and engagement strategy is most likely to develop and to evolve. And I think it'll be very much an organic develiment. This is not
imposed,
not an orchestrated or
That's right.
carefully contrived balancing of China.
Sure.
It's not an alliance, for instance. I mean, many of the key countries that may be involved in this balance are countries that instinctively do not want to have
any alliance.
Yeah.
That's true. So India has that instinct
Yes.
very much deep rooted in its thing. So finally, what do you think of Quad?
Well, look, I think the Quad can over time develop into quite an important mechanism. I think in terms of engaging and balancing China, the Quad is in a sense a natural focus for that. I think the United States, Japan, India and Australia have a measure of congruent strategic interests. They're also all countries that are committed to an open and democratic system. So they bring values and interests together in quite a distinctive way. I don't expect the Quad to develop very rapidly. I think the sensible thing with the Quad is to expand it in careful increments.
Sure.
And I think we should be open-minded about whether there may be others that over time might wish to also be part of that grouping.
Indonesia, for instance.
Indonesia could be one, but Indonesia will also be, in a sense, constrained by where the ASEAN position is.
That's right.
And ASEAN traditionally has sought to keep a measure of distance from the great powers.
That's true. So, irrespective of whether Quad develops fast or goes incrementally, the bilateral relationship between India and Australia, as you see it, is poised for a big takeoff.
Yes, I see this as a very significant relationship. Certainly, from an Australian perspective, we see it as a very significant relationship, and I think it's got the core elements for a relationship of real substance. So my report fleshes out the economic dimension of the relationship and the growth tissue that's evident there. I think we have been seeing a geostrategic convergence which has moved much faster, frankly, than I would have expected. I mean, if you think of the old days when India was locked into a non-aligned
Yes.
Paradigm, and Australia was seen in India as an ally of the United States with minimal strategic congruence.
Yes.
I mean, we've moved a long way
Oh yes.
from that time, and I think as the region goes through more flux and uncertainty, some of those connecting points between Australia and India will become even more important, and I think that'll be manifested with a closer relationship in the defence and security field.
Yes.
I think we're already doing joint naval exercises.
Yes.
For instance, it's a very good thing.
True.
Our armed services are having more to do with each other. We have a good dialogue, bringing together the secretaries of defence and foreign affairs. So these are all
building blocks
of a growing strategic relationship.
Yeah. So on that note, thank you very much for your time and
Thank you.
being so candid about what you're doing.
My pleasure.
I wish you the very best.
Thank you. Thank you.